This is for our Eminent Psychologist podcast. I'm here with Samantha and this is Malcolm, and I'm going to be talking about Carl Jung. And Samantha, who are you going to be talking about?
Elizabeth Loftus.
Okay. So I wanted to start off, I'm going to start with Carl Jung. I'm going to start off with a quote that I found very interesting. It says, anyone who wants to know the human psyche will learn next to nothing from experimental psychology. He would be better advised to abandon exact science, put away his scholar's gown, bid farewell to his study, and wander with human heart throughout the world. There in the horrors of prisons, lunatic asylums, and hospitals, in drab suburban pubs, in brothels and gambling hells, in the salons of the elegant, the stock exchanges, socialist meetings, churches, revivalist gatherings, and ecstatic sex, through love and hate, through the experience of passion in every form, in his own body, he would reap richer stores of knowledge than textbooks a foot thick could give him. And he will know how to doctor the sick with a real knowledge of the human soul. So I found that quote really hit me, that he felt that, trying to do experiments in psychology really don't benefit from actually experiencing things in the real world. So Carl Jung was born on July 26, 1875 in the small Swiss village of Kesselwell. His father was Paul Jung. He was a pastor for a small church, and his mother was Emily Jung. He had a fairly well-educated family, including a few family members who were clergymen. His father definitely encouraged his early education, but he was a very solitary adolescent. He had a hard time in his early schooling and actually developed a tendency to faint under pressure, which really made it hard for him to learn. But he was able to overcome that eventually and finish his schooling. He initially wanted to become a pastor like his father, but after attending the University of Basel, he decided to study medicine and finally decided to study psychiatry. One of the big aspects of his life is his relationship with Sigmund Freud. In 1906, he published Diagnostics Association Studies along with fellow Swiss psychiatrist Franz Ricklin. He actually sent a copy of the publication to Freud, which ended up leading to a lengthy correspondence between the two. They actually met in person in 1907 and had a 13-hour straight conversation, which boggles my mind because I can't even think of any time I've had more than a couple-hour conversation, but they went on for 13 hours straight. They collaborated very closely over the next 6 years, and they actually went on several trips to North American universities to discuss their studies with other psychologists, psychiatrists, and neurologists. Freud looked at Jung to be his heir apparent and called him, quote, his adopted eldest son, his crown prince, and successor, quote. And he had him appointed for a 2-year term at the newly formed International Psychoanalytical Association. They had an intense collaboration over those 6 years, but ultimately broke apart over disagreements related to the impact of libido. Freud looked at everything at libido from a strictly sexual perspective, whereas Jung looked at libido as like everything in part of life, and they had this disagreement that on the formation of libido and on the formation of personality, as well as they had several disagreements about unconsciousness. Here are some of the key concepts that are credited to Jung. One of the major ones is collective unconsciousness. Jung agreed with Freud about the concept of personal unconsciousness, which is where a person's unconscious mind is filled with thoughts and emotions that person has experienced or thought in their conscious mind, but may have been forgotten or repressed. But Jung also theorized that humans have a collective unconsciousness, which consists of memories and experiences that we inherit from our ancestors that we can't be conscious of. There's a theory that we're all connected as a species based on the memories and experiences of our forebears. One example that came to mind about this is, most people are afraid of snakes, or they know like that a rattlesnake sound means danger. That kind of came to me like, oh, that's something that I would not have been conscious of, but I would know that, anyway. So another key concept is archetypes. This is a quote that I found that I thought was important from Jung. Said, my views about the archaic remnants, which I call archetypes or primordial images, have been constantly criticized by people who lack sufficient knowledge of the psychology of dreams and mythology. The term archetype is often misunderstood as meaning certain definite mythological images or motifs, but these are nothing more than conscious representations. Such variable representations cannot be inherited. The archetype is a tendency to form such representations of a motif, representations that can vary greatly in detail, or a great deal in detail, without losing their basic pattern, end quote. Another concept that he is credited with is the persona, which is the mask that we put on for the outside world. I thought it was very interesting because if you think about it, who we are by ourselves is not usually the person that we are when we're out in public. He also came up with the concept of extroversion and introversion. Talk about that in a little bit. I want to talk about some personality tests that I've had some experience with. Another key concept for Carl Jung was synchronicity. Synchronicity is the occurrence of two events that are not linked causally nor linked teleologically, yet are meaningfully related. This is a quote. So once a client was describing a dream involving a scarab beetle when at that very instant, a very similar beetle flew into the window. Often people dream about something like the death of a loved one and find out the next morning that their loved one did in fact die at about that time. Sometimes people pick up the phone to call a friend only to find that their friend is already on the line. Most psychologists would call these coincidences or try to show how they are more likely to occur than we think. Jung believed that these were indications of how we were connected with our fellow humans and with nature in general through the collective unconsciousness. Some of his travels, Jung traveled all over Europe, discussing his ideas with other intellectuals and other intellectual scientists and psychologists. He also traveled to the United States several times and was honored with multiple honorary degrees from universities such as Fordham University, Harvard University, and Clark University. He also traveled to East Africa and tried to conduct the Bigushu psychological expedition to try to understand primitive psychology. Unfortunately, there were a lot of language barriers there. It had caused some issues with understanding some of these culturally isolated residents. Jung published more than 10 books throughout his life. Most famous are Psychology of the Unconscious, Psychological Types, Answers to Job, and The Red Book. So let's talk a little about collective unconsciousness and archetypes. I thought that was really interesting. It was not a concept that I was really familiar with. But I think if you think about it, there's, things in life that you may not have personally experienced, but you just kind of know,
Or
right?
sometimes you like have dreams of stuff that hasn't happened yet and then it will happen, or like something similar.
Right.
Because I've experienced that. Like I've had dreams of something that I dreamed about, and then it's something really similar to it happened, and it kind of brought that back up. And you're like,
Right.
oh, I dreamed about this,
Right.
It's not something you really think of.
Right. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was a lot of the studies led to different personality tests. And I personally have had worked with a few things with the DISC personality test, taking a few courses with that. Highly recommend taking those because it teaches you a lot about yourself, the type of person you are, how to interact with people of different personalities. When I took my first test and got the results, I talked to my wife about it, and she goes, "That's you to a T." So I'm a very steady person. That just taught me a lot, about myself and how I best interact with others. And it was very rewarding for me. So that's what I've got on Jung. Let's talk about your psychologist.
All right. So I had Elizabeth Loftus, and she is one of those eminent psychologists famous for the groundbreaking works and contributions in the field of cognitive and human memory. She's really more famous for the false memory. She's went and done a lot of work with eyewitness trials, which people really think that eyewitness testimonies are it's the most used, and they think it's the best, but really it can be the worst because people will have a false memory of what happened, and they're really open and suggestible.
Yep. And studies have shown that eyewitness testimony is the least reliable.
Yes. And so her early life really plays into why she studied what she studied and why she really focused on this area. So she was born in Los Angeles on October 16th, 1944, to parents Sidney and Rebecca Fishman, both of Jewish descent. Her father was a United States Army doctor, and her mother worked as a librarian. When Elizabeth was 14 years old, her mother passed away in a drowning accident. Loftus had a very challenging childhood that was marked by abuse, loss, and grief. When she was just 6 years old, she was molested by a male babysitter. She chose not to tell her parents about the incident. Although she never forgot what happened, she was able to put the experience behind her and move forward. But she still had a very troubled life.
It sounds like it.
As a young girl, she enjoyed reading books and watching television shows about true and fictionalized crime. She also had a passion for mathematics, perhaps because her father was also proficient at solving math problems. Loftus had a difficult time communicating with her father and noted that math was one thing that they had in common to talk about. Most of their interactions were concerned around her math homework, so it doesn't sound like she had a very good relationship with her father.
Mm-hmm.
Loftus did not have a very close relationship with her mother either. When her mother became sick, she wanted to spend time with her. Loftus would often respond she was too busy, or when her mother would come in her room, they would eventually start arguing because her mother didn't seem as if she ever wanted to leave, So she didn't really have a very good relationship with either parents. Loftus kept a diary during her teenage years, though. However, she was afraid someone else might get their hands on it and read it. To address this, she wrote most of her private thoughts on separate pieces of paper and clipped them into her diary. If her boyfriend ever asked to read the diary, she could just unclip the removable truths before handing him the diary to read. So she was really conscious of what she revealed to everybody. She didn't want to reveal the real truth.
Right.
Or what was very personal to her. When she was 14 years old, her mother drowned in a swimming pool. Although reports claim that her mother's death was accident, her father suspected that it was suicide. In Loftus's grief, she determined God was not real, because he did not intervene to stop her mother from dying, and he didn't save her mother. She later wrote in her diary that her biggest regret in life was not spending time with her mother when she had the available chance to.
Right.
And then 2 years after her mother died, her home burned down. She lost many of her possessions, but she was most anxious about not finding her diaries right away. She was relieved when she got them back. Loftus was not concerned her diaries may have been burned in the fire, but that someone else would find them and read them. And despite the trauma she experienced in her youth, though, she continued to press on with life, even though it was probably extremely difficult with everything that had happened. She became a workaholic in high school and devoted herself to her studies. She completed a bachelor's in psychology and mathematics from the University of California in Los Angeles in 1966. She was the only female in the program that year. Not only were her classmates male, but her professors also. Her classmates also voted her the least likely to succeed as a psychologist and placed bets on when she would quit mathematical psychology. So she really did.
Not surprising for the men's attitudes back then and even sometimes today.
She had a lot of challenges with pursuing what she really wanted to. And she received her master's degree in mathematical psychology in 1967.
So the year later.
Yeah, a year later.
After everybody said she would not do it.
She did it.
That's awesome.
During her second year at Stanford, Loftus was assigned to mentor a new student named Gregor Loftus. They married on June 30th, 1968, and the final year of her PhD program, Loftus began studying the retrieval of information for long-term systematic memory. She earned her PhD in 1970 from Stanford University in mathematical psychology. So she has quite a few degrees.
She not only got her master's, but she got her PhD.
She is very amazing. Educated. She started off her career by becoming a researcher at New Schools for Social Research in 1970. Misfortune, Misinformation, Effect, and Eyewitness Testimony are her major groundbreaking works in the field of psychology. Through her studies of memory, she has revealed that not only is human memory often surprisingly unreliable, but also prone to errors and susceptible to suggestion. Though some of her research work and experimental techniques have received criticism, she has done very remarkable research concerning human memory and cognitive psychology. So a lot of it has been criticized and questioned, but probably from people who are on trial and people who have been through a trial and been wrongly convicted over eyewitness testimonies that were false or kind of coached. Some of them can be coached. And then the school of thought that she pioneered through is this was a really personal thing for her, I feel like. So I think she really was interested in it. But one quote she said is, "Eyewitnesses who point their fingers at innocent defendants are not liars, for they genuinely believe in the truth of their testimony." That's the frightening part. The truly horrifying idea that we think we know what we believe with all our hearts is not necessarily the truth. And she said this in 1996. So it was not that very long ago that she said this, and her research is still being used today in trials that we see every day. So Loftus had a close experience with the fragility of human memory. At a family gathering on her 44th birthday, Loftus's uncle told her that she had been the one to find her mother's body floating in the pool after the drowning incident. Before that, she had remembered very little about the incident, but after her uncle's comment, the details suddenly started to come back to her. A few days later, she discovered that her uncle had been mistaken. and that it was actually her aunt who discovered her mother after the drowning. All it took to trigger a false memory was a simple comment from a family member, illustrating how easily the human memory can be influenced by suggestion. So there's probably a very traumatic couple of days because you don't really remember something and then someone says that you did something that you really didn't.
It's amazing that in what she's been studying, it came right back to her and impacted her personally. Wow. On such a traumatic, incident too. Wow.
What were the major findings of their research and what the outcomes of the experiments were is that there's false memory. And so one of the experiments that they did was the misfortune event occurred when misleading information presents after an event interferes with one's memory of the event. The event was first demonstrated by Loftus and her colleagues in 1970. In one study, the researchers showed participants a series of slides, one of which depicted a car at a stop sign after a delay. Some of the participants were presented with misleading information suggesting that the car had stopped at a yield sign instead. Participants were then tested on what they saw. Of the participants who received misleading information, a large portion, about 57%, reported seeing a yield sign in the original slide, demonstrating how easily people's memories for detail can be transformed and suggested. And then this is not the only study that they did. They did more than one to prove this. Another study by Loftus and Stephen Palmer showed how post-event information can distort not only what people think they saw, but also the conclusions they draw about the event. And this can be really big with, like I said, trials where people are up for murder or car incidents or something. Their memories can be changed and altered where it's not the truth.
Right.
So participants in the study were shown video footage of a car crash and were then asked to estimate the speed at which the cars had been traveling. Some participants were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. Others were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. Although both groups saw the same clip, those who heard the word smashed estimated the cars were going at a faster speed on average than those who heard the word hit, about 41 miles per hour versus 34 miles per hour.
So that word suggestion really impacted what they thought they saw.
And then 1 week later, participants in the study were asked if there was any broken glass at the scene of the crash. Although there was no broken glass in the original video clip, 2 to 3% of those in the smashed condition reported seeing broken glass. Only 14 of those in the hit condition did so. These results show that even non-existent details can be implanted into people's memories of events. So if someone just suggests something, it always is one of those things that you may have not said, oh, that was there before, but since someone suggested that, you say, oh, maybe it was, and it alters your memory of what really happened.
Yeah. And all it takes is one word. A change of one word.
Oh, yeah, that's the scary part, is it's only a change in one word that really impacted the study.
Wow.
And then according to Loftus, the misinformation effect occurs between misleading PEI permanently replaces or interferes with the original memory that are formed when an event is witnessed. And then Loftus and others have identified several factors that influences people's susceptibility to the misinformation effect. These include your age. Younger children are a lot more susceptible to someone like ideas coming in, and then also some elderly adults too, their memory's not the best, and they are, they trust someone and then they believe what they say and it's not the truth.
Well, one of the things we talked about last time, we were talking about with age, and I was telling you about the daycare center up in Massachusetts back in the late 80s, I believe, where these kids were couched into to thinking these people hurt them and molested them. And they came up with these crazy stories like, dragons had taken them away and all these crazy things. And these kids believed it. And they actually went and testified in court. And these people ended up going to prison over it. I mean, they were eventually
true. And the children were just repeating what they were told to say.
Luckily, the people were eventually exonerated, but they still went to prison, which is just a horrible thing to go through.
Another thing is time. Once time has passed, your memory is not as fresh in your mind. So you have to like pull it back out. And sometimes memories can be altered, or if you've ever heard this saying, the same story is never told twice.
Right.
So, I mean, that can cause people to incorrectly, remember things or take a suggestion, that didn't really happen. And then the credibility of source, misleading information from credible sources result in more errors than similar information from non-credible sources. And then the types of details. So memories of perhaps like, something that was just small and not really significant, you're not going to remember every little detail, even when it's a big event, like say you're in a car wreck, you may not remember exactly what happened in every second, but you remember like the major things.
Right.
But it's still just some details can be forgotten, and then some can be really like, you hold on to one small little detail and you focus on that instead of the bigger picture.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you personal experience. I've been in a couple of major car wrecks. I could not tell you what type of car I hit. I could not tell you what color it was, anything like that. I mean, remember my car, but I don't remember.
You remember it happened, but you don't remember the specific details for it. And then her impact on society was really that it made people really rethink eyewitness testimonies and, people testifying and the information that they're really presenting. And it has honestly had a major impact on the eyewitness testimonies for good reason. I mean, but, and see, this can also be brought back up with people who have been falsely accused, like say there was a child that was coached into saying something that wasn't true, and it puts someone in prison. Well, then they find out that that memory really wasn't what they said it was. So in children, they don't always tell the truth, but it's also kind of hard to believe children too when their memory is just their brain's still mush. They're just absorbing everything they hear. So it's one of those things.
Not to mention all the media influence they have too. That totally impacts their brains and
then also with memories. The recovered memory, that can also, she's done some research with those, and when you go to recover a memory, you may not remember every detail in it, and it also may have been altered over what people have said over time. So she is also accredited with a lot of awards that she has got over her time of research, and that her findings have brought her a lot of awards that are too many to list, but she has multiple awards, and she is very well educated in her field, and her studies have really been it have a big impact on society. And I feel like it's had a big impact on people's personal lives, because when you're falsely accused of something and then someone's adamant about you did this, and sometimes it makes people believe that they actually did something that they did not do. So I feel like that has had an impact on probably everyone's personal life in some situation, but also really on society.
Okay.
That's what I have.
Okay, good. I think that should do it for us, and we'll get this sent in.